She smiled, but her eyes held a fire he couldn't ignore, and it was only the beginning. The rain had been falling steadily all afternoon, painting the streets in a glossy sheen that reflected the golden glow of the cafe windows. He hesitated at the doorway, coat collar turned up against the drizzle, scanning the cozy interior for an empty table. It wasn't the warmth he sought, exactly. It was curiosity. He had a habit of noticing the small details that others overlooked. The way a barista's hands moved with ease, the faint steam curling from a cup of coffee, the soft hum of quiet conversations. But that day, something, or rather someone, captured his attention more than any detail of the cafe could. She was seated by the window, a leather-bound notebook open before her, a pen poised but unmoving in her hand. At first glance, she looked serene, the kind of calm that comes from someone who has walked through life with confidence. Yet beneath that calm was something else, a subtle intensity that made her presence undeniable. Her hair fell in gentle waves over her shoulders, and though she smiled occasionally at a note in her book, her eyes were alive, alert, almost challenging, as though she could see right into the world around her, and perhaps into him. He found himself studying her without realizing it, not in a way that was intrusive, but in a quiet fascination. The way her fingers brushed a stray lock of hair from her face, the subtle crease of concentration in her brow, the curve of her lips when she looked up from her notebook and glanced at the rain outside. There was something magnetic about her, not loud, not obvious, but undeniably present. As he settled into a seat nearby, pretending to read the menu, he couldn't help but notice the small movements that revealed her personality. A slight shift of her shoulders, as if adjusting not just her posture, but the space around her. The gentle tapping of her pen on the page, as though thinking aloud. She seemed so composed, yet there was fire in her gaze, a quiet intensity that made him both nervous and intrigued. Their eyes met briefly when he reached for his coffee. There was no awkwardness, no forced smile, just a fleeting recognition, as if a silent acknowledgement had passed between them. It was enough to make him aware of his own heartbeat. The way the warmth of his hands holding the cup contrasted with the cool drizzle outside. She returned to her notebook, but he noticed the way her gaze lingered on the window for a moment longer, almost as if she were inviting him into her world without words. He didn't speak. Words would have felt clumsy, unnecessary, at least for now. Instead, he let himself observe, to take in the small details that made her presence so compelling. The gentle curve of her jaw, the way her shoulders relaxed when she thought no one was watching, the soft cadence of her breathing. By the time he left the cafe that afternoon, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, but he felt as if a storm had passed through him. That first encounter didn't need grand gestures or dramatic revelations. It was enough that she existed in the same space, that he had noticed her smile, and that behind it burned a quiet, irresistible fire. It was a beginning. And beginnings, he knew, were often the most potent sparks. The following week, he found himself wandering the narrow aisles of the bookstore, a place he rarely visited. But today's something, he couldn't say what, drew him there. Perhaps it was the memory of her fire-lit gaze from the cafe, lingering like a quiet echo. He wandered past stacks of novels and poetry, pretending to browse, though his eyes kept drifting to the far end of the aisle. And there she was. She was reaching for a leather-bound edition of a classic novel, her fingers grazing the spine with careful deliberation. Her profile was partially hidden by soft waves of hair, yet even in that subtle tilt of her head, there was a strength that commanded attention. He paused, telling himself it was accidental. This was, after all, a bookstore, and coincidences were possible. But his heartbeat betrayed him. The pull toward her was unmistakable. Their hands reached for the same book simultaneously. A spark of electricity passed through the brief contact. He quickly withdrew, offering a small, polite smile, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she looked up at him, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between them, a quiet acknowledgement that this meeting wasn't entirely by chance. They spoke lightly, words hovering just above casual, careful not to reveal too much of the curiosity swelling inside them. He asked if she had read the book before, She replied with a smile and a soft, knowing shake of her head. Their conversation lingered, measured but charged, as they drifted between titles and authors. There was a rhythm to it, like two dancers feeling out the steps without ever touching, yet deeply aware of each other's presence. He noticed how her gestures were graceful, but contained, movements that suggested confidence honed by experience. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, and he caught the faint scent of. By the time they parted, it was with no dramatic farewell, just a quiet exchange of smiles that carried the weight of curiosity, of unspoken questions. He lingered at the exit, watching her disappear between the aisles, feeling the pull of her presence like gravity. She had stirred something in him, a mixture of fascination, admiration, and a gentle longing that refused to be ignored. The world felt subtly altered afterward. Everyday noises, footsteps, the rustle of pages, distant chatter, seemed sharper, more immediate, as though he were noticing life itself in a way he hadn't before. And he couldn't shake the feeling that their paths would cross again, intentionally or not, each encounter adding layers to a connection neither fully understood yet. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was the beginning of recognition, an acknowledgement that some people enter your life with the quiet power to shift the way you notice everything else. And for him, she had done exactly that. The days that followed were quiet, punctuated by small reminders of her presence in his mind. He found himself scanning cafes, streets, and bookstores, half expecting to see her smile or feel the pull of her gaze. But the universe seemed to have other plans. She was absent. He imagined her in motion somewhere, graceful and purposeful, yet just out of reach. That absence, subtle as it was, stirred an unfamiliar tension in him, an ache mixed with curiosity, longing, and self-doubt. It wasn't long before they crossed paths again, though the meeting lacked the easy warmth of their earlier encounters. He spotted her in the park, seated on a bench with a sketch pad, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across her features. She looked serene, absorbed in her work, yet something in the tilt of her head and the tightness of her lips suggested caution, even restraint. He approached slowly, aware of the subtle barrier that now existed between them, unsure whether to breach it. Their conversation began lightly, as if testing the waters. Words were polite, measured, careful. He asked about her day. She responded with brief smiles and soft answers. But beneath the surface, unspoken questions hung like mist. He caught the way her eyes flicked toward him, then quickly looked away, betraying a hesitation that made his chest tighten. Something unsaid lingered, a subtle distance that hadn't been there before. Physicality, once effortless, was now fraught with uncertainty. When their hands nearly brushed while reaching for the same pen, both flinched slightly and withdrew, a small, almost imperceptible acknowledgement of boundaries. The warmth he had felt in their previous encounters was replaced by the delicate tension of proximity, the kind that makes every glance heavy and every pause meaningful. Internally, he wrestled with a mix of emotions: admiration for her composure, confusion at the sudden reserve, and a quiet frustration at the invisible wall between them. He wondered if he had misread her earlier warmth, if his attentiveness had been intrusive, or if the unspoken awareness of their age difference weighed more heavily on her than he had realized. She, too, was navigating the same internal storm. Her attraction, fascination, and curiosity toward him were undeniable, yet she hesitated, questioning the appropriateness of her feelings. She appreciated his attentiveness, his quiet sincerity, yet the age difference, combined with the weight of her own past, made her cautious. She wanted to lean in, to reach out, but each time she almost allowed herself, doubt held her back. The encounter ended without resolution, with both walking away carrying the weight of what had passed and what had been left unsaid. The tension was not born of anger or misunderstanding, but of the delicate fear of vulnerability, the fear of revealing a desire that might be considered complicated, even forbidden. For him, the uncertainty was sharp and magnetic. It made him notice every detail: the way she tucked her hair behind her ear with deliberate care, the faint crease of concentration on her brow, the subtle lift of her shoulders when she hesitated before responding. Each gesture was a question, each glance a silent challenge. And as he watched her disappear among the golden glow of the setting sun, he realized that the slow burn of their connection was becoming something more fragile, more intoxicating. The fire in her eyes was still there, but now it flickered with hesitation, and it called to him in ways he was only beginning to understand. The days after their tense park encounter felt both heavier and lighter at once. He couldn't stop thinking about her, the way her eyes had held hesitation, the subtle fire that still shimmered beneath her restraint. And yet, there was a growing certainty in him, a quiet determination that their connection, delicate though it was, deserved attention. He realized that sometimes love wasn't declared in grand gestures or dramatic confessions. Sometimes it lived in the small, unnoticed acts that made another person feel seen, understood, and safe. It began with simple attentiveness. He remembered her favorite coffee from the café, the rich, earthy aroma she had mentioned almost in passing. One morning, without pretense, he arrived early and ordered it, holding the cup with warmth against his hands as he made his way to her table. When she noticed him, there was no shock or hesitation, only that familiar, knowing smile, a quiet acknowledgement that he had been paying attention. Her eyes softened, and for a moment, the air between them seemed to hum with subtle understanding. Small gestures continued to build like tiny sparks. She left a book on his doorstep with a handwritten note tucked between the pages, her elegant script delicate yet deliberate. The words weren't declarations of love. They were observations, reflections, pieces of herself that she chose to share. When he held the book, her note brushing his fingers, he felt a warmth that lingered in his chest, an unspoken connection that words alone could never convey. Physicality remained gentle but significant. When she passed him the book, their fingers brushed lightly, deliberate and tender, long enough for the contact to register without needing explanation. She tucked a curl of hair behind her ear as he smiled at her, an unconscious gesture that carried familiarity, trust, and subtle intimacy. Every small movement spoke louder than words. The tilt of her head, the brief glances that lingered, the quiet space they created together, even in public. Even in the silence, the gestures resonated. Sitting side by side in the cafe, sipping coffee, they didn't need to fill the gaps with words. The occasional touch, a hand resting briefly on a chair back, knees almost brushing, was enough. It spoke of awareness, attentiveness, and mutual care. There was no rush, no expectation, just the quiet reinforcement that each person mattered to the other, that connection could grow in patience and subtlety. These small, deliberate acts began to ease the tension of their previous misunderstanding. The hesitancy of part 4 gradually melted, replaced with a sense of trust that was as quiet as it was profound. The fire in her eyes was no longer cautious. It glimmered with acknowledgement, curiosity, and the tiniest hint of anticipation. For him, every gesture was a revelation. The pull between them grows stronger, but is measured, patient, and emotionally satisfying, a prelude to the emotional climax yet to come. Twilight settled over the city like a soft, golden veil, filtering through the leaves of the quiet park where he had arranged to meet her. The warm light cast long, gentle shadows across the benches and pathways, turning familiar places into something intimate, and when she sat down beside him, the distance between them felt charged, weighted with all the unspoken emotions that had grown since their first encounter. Their conversation began softly, almost cautiously. Words brushed against each other, light and tentative, as if testing the waters. He spoke first, carefully, admitting how he had noticed her, how her presence had lingered in his thoughts far longer than expected. His voice was steady, though there was an edge of vulnerability beneath it, an honesty that carried the weight of sincere feeling. She listened, her hands resting lightly in her lap, her expression open but measured, waiting to see how much he would dare to reveal. She responded in kind, her voice soft, deliberate, carrying the warmth of someone who had fought to guard her heart, but was now willing to let it show. She admitted the curiosity, the fascination, the subtle longing she had felt, emotions tempered by caution, but no less real. For the first time, the distance between their hearts seemed to shrink, not with grand declarations, but with honest, measured admission. Physicality in this moment was deliberate and tender. When he reached out to brush a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingered near her cheek, careful and reverent. She leaned slightly into the gesture, a quiet affirmation of trust, letting the warmth of his hand linger without hesitation. Later, their hands found each other naturally, fingers intertwining slowly, deliberately, as if testing the comfort of closeness they had only dared to imagine. Each touch, each glance, each pause in conversation carried emotional weight, an affirmation of connection and mutual care. They spoke of fear and hesitation, of societal perception, of the age difference that had shadowed their interactions but had never diminished the depth of their understanding. Each confession was met with reassurance, each pause filled with the kind of silence that communicates more than words ever could. The fire in her eyes was no longer restrained. It shimmered with recognition, acceptance, and the quiet thrill of vulnerability shared without pretense. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the emotional crescendo had been reached. They didn't need a dramatic kiss or a sweeping gesture. The intimacy was in the closeness of their bodies, the lingering glances, the warmth of hands entwined, the mutual acknowledgement that they had crossed the threshold of hesitation into honest connection. In that quiet park, surrounded by the gentle twilight, the slow-burn romance ignited fully, not in urgency, but in patience, respect, and deeply felt emotional truth. The audience witnesses not a climax of passion, but a climax of intimacy. Hearts laid bare, trust affirmed, and desire acknowledged in ways that feel profoundly human and YouTube safe. The days that followed their heartfelt confession were quiet in their own way. No grand gestures, no dramatic declarations, just the calm, steady rhythm of two people discovering the comfort of closeness. The city seemed softer somehow, every street corner and café imbued with a warmth that reflected their newfound connection. There was no rush, no urgency. Each moment carried the subtle joy of shared presence, the kind that grows in patience, attentiveness, and mutual care. They returned to the café where it had all begun. The familiar amber glow of the lights, the soft murmur of conversation, and the faint scent of freshly ground coffee created a sense of continuity, a place where beginnings and resolutions could coexist. She arrived first, setting her notebook aside, a quiet anticipation in the tilt of her head. He entered moments later, coat draped casually over his shoulders, eyes scanning the room until they found hers. No words were necessary. The recognition in their gazes conveyed everything. Physicality was now natural, effortless, and comforting. He slid into the chair beside her, their shoulders brushing lightly, a touch that spoke of familiarity and quiet intimacy. She didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned slightly toward him, resting an elbow on the table and letting their hands meet in the space between them. Fingers intertwined, they shared a closeness that required no explanation, a tactile affirmation of the emotional bond that had grown steadily over weeks. Conversation flowed freely, unhurried and genuine. They spoke of small details, the books they were reading, the changing seasons, the rhythm of their daily routines. But beneath the surface, every word carried meaning. Every smile, every shared glance, every fleeting touch reinforced the trust and warmth that had taken root. When she brushed a strand of hair from her face, he caught her hand gently, letting it linger, a small act of connection that needed no words. The fire that had always shimmered in her eyes was no longer restrained by hesitation or doubt. It now glimmered with joy, warmth, and acceptance. For him, there was a quiet satisfaction in seeing her relaxed. Her confidence and grace paired seamlessly with the vulnerability she had allowed him to witness. The age difference, once a silent consideration, had become irrelevant, replaced entirely by mutual respect, admiration, and the subtle, steady pull of shared understanding. They sat together for hours, the world around them fading into soft background noise. Every laugh, every pause, every gentle gesture was a testament to the slow-burn intimacy they had cultivated. When they leaned closer to share a whispered comment or a quiet observation, the warmth of proximity was enough to carry the emotional weight they both felt. There was no need for dramatic declarations. The bond had been forged in patience, attentiveness, and subtle tenderness. By the time they left the café, sunlight filtered through the windows, casting a golden glow over the city streets. They walked side by side, fingers brushing naturally, sharing smiles that were at once private and infinitely significant. In that simple togetherness, the slow-burn romance reached its full resolution, not with fireworks or urgency, but with harmony, warmth, and deep emotional satisfaction. The audience is left with a profound sense that love, when nurtured patiently, can flourish quietly and beautifully. It is a connection built on attentiveness, respect, subtle affection, and emotional honesty, a romance that burns softly, steadily, and leaves hearts fully content.